The annual members' meeting at Renford Country Club had reached the point where people stopped pretending it was about flowers, menus, or tournament schedules. Rain tapped against the tall windows of the oak-paneled ballroom. Crystal glasses stood untouched on white cloth. At the front of the room, Meredith Hale, the club's executive director, held a termination letter between two fingers as though it were something dirty. "M.R. Mercer," she said, "you were instructed to stay off club property after your dismissal." Daniel Mercer stood near the rear doors in a faded green groundskeeper's jacket, rain darkening the shoulders. His 10-year-old daughter, Lily, held his left hand with both of hers. In his right hand was a narrow cedar box that had belonged to his late wife. Its brass hinge was worn smooth from years of opening and closing. A security guard waited beside him, uncomfortable. Meredith looked past Daniel toward the board. "This is precisely the kind of disruption we can no longer tolerate. He is not a member. He is not management. He is a former employee who has chosen to embarrass the club." Daniel did not raise his voice. "I came because your attorney sent notice of a vote affecting the land." A few members glanced at one another. Meredith gave a patient smile, the kind used on people she had already decided not to hear. "The land is not your concern." Lily's grip tightened. Daniel felt the small paper folded inside his coat pocket, the receipt from the pharmacy that morning. Cough medicine, $9.87. The balance left in his checking account after buying it was $38.42. He could feel every eye in the room measuring the mud on his boots against the polished floor. Meredith stepped down from the platform. "You worked here," she said. "That did not make this place yours." Daniel looked at the long table where the board sat beneath portraits of men who had been dead for 50 years. "No," he said. "Working here didn't." He placed the cedar box on the nearest table and opened it. The room leaned forward. But before anyone could see what was inside, Daniel looked toward Lily. She was staring at Meredith with the same wounded confusion she had worn the day the director kicked her father's toolbox into the mud. 2 weeks earlier, Meredith Hale believed she was removing a troublesome employee. Before the night was over, she would discover she had been ordering the owner of the ground beneath her feet to leave. If this story has your attention, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. 2 weeks earlier, Daniel arrived at Renford every morning at 5:40, before the chefs lit the kitchen and before the first luxury car rolled past the iron gates. The club sat on 212 acres of old Virginia farmland. Rolling fairways, white fences, stone bridges, and groves of oaks older than the clubhouse itself. To members, the property looked effortless. Daniel knew effort was buried everywhere. It was in the irrigation valves beneath the third fairway, the drainage channels behind the tennis courts, the root systems under the eastern lawn, and the retaining wall that held the lower gardens above Mill Creek. He knew which sprinklers ran rich, which mower pulled left, and which oak would split in a hard western wind. He had worked there for 7 years. Most people thought that was all he was. That morning, Lily sat in the break room doorway wearing a purple backpack and eating toast from a paper towel while Daniel repaired the throttle cable on a utility cart. "Missers, Donnelly says parents aren't supposed to bring kids to work," she said. "She also says school starts at 8:10. And the bus doesn't come to our road anymore, so today you're my assistant groundskeeper until 7:30. Lily smiled. "Do assistants get paid? They get toast." "That's not legal." Daniel pulled the cable tight and tested the pedal. "Then don't report me," she laughed, and the sound loosened something in his chest. 2 years had passed since Daniel's wife, Claire, died after a short, violent illness that rearranged the world in 6 weeks. Before that, their mornings had been loud. Coffee, lost shoes, radio weather, Claire calling from the hallway that nobody had signed the school form. Afterward, silence had taken up more space than furniture. Daniel had learned to braid hair badly, then adequately. He had learned which cough sounded like a cold and which meant the pediatric clinic. He had learned that grief could sit quietly beside a child while she ate cereal and still be heavier than anything a man could carry. At 6:15, a black sedan stopped beside the maintenance barn. Meredith Hale stepped out in a cream coat and heels too narrow for gravel. She had become executive director 11 months earlier, brought in by the board to rescue Renford from declining membership and a debt load nobody discussed outside closed meetings. She was efficient, polished, and rarely surprised. Her career had been built by turning struggling resorts into profitable properties, and she believed every problem could be solved if sentiment was removed early enough. She looked at Lily first. Children are not permitted in operational areas. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag. Her bus route was canceled. She'll be gone before members arrive. Rules are most useful before exceptions become habits. She's here for an hour. Meredith's smile did not reach her eyes. That is what an exception sounds like when it is asking to become a habit. Lily lowered her toast. Daniel felt anger rise faster than he wanted. She's 10, and this is a workplace. He took a breath. Claire had once told him that his silence was powerful until it became a wall. Since her death, he had built too many walls. I understand, he said. Meredith turned toward the utility cart. Is that the one assigned to guest services? It was. The throttle cable was frayed. Our equipment contractor inspected the fleet last week. They missed this one. Her gaze moved to his grease-blackened fingers. The contractor is certified. The cable doesn't know that. For the first time, her expression changed. Not shock, exactly, but irritation at being answered by someone whose uniform carried soil at the knees. She looked at the cart, pressed the pedal, and heard the engine settle evenly. Have it documented, she said. I already did. She walked toward the clubhouse without another word. Lily waited until the sedan driver had followed. She doesn't like you. She doesn't know me. She didn't like not knowing you. Daniel looked at his daughter. That, he said, is an expensive sentence for someone who gets paid in toast. At 7:25, he drove Lily to school in a 12-year-old pickup with a heater that worked only on high. On the passenger floor sat the cedar box Claire had inherited from Daniel's grandfather. Daniel kept it in the truck because the roof of their rented house leaked above the bedroom closet. Inside the box were old survey pins, a brass key, a handwritten letter, and documents Daniel had not shown anyone at Renford. He had not hidden them out of shame. He had hidden them because his grandfather had asked him to wait. The Mercer family had owned the land long before Renford existed. In 1959, Daniel's grandfather, Thomas Mercer, had signed a 70-year ground lease with the club's founders. The agreement allowed Renford to build and operate, but the land itself remained in the Mercer family trust. The trust was quiet by design. Rent was modest. Certain groves and waterways were protected. Any expansion beyond the original development boundary required written consent from the trustee. 3 years before Claire died, Daniel had become that trustee. He had taken the groundskeeping job under his own name because he wanted to understand what the club had become before the lease entered its final decade. His grandfather's final letter had been direct. Never judge the place from the dining room, it said. Learn how it treats the people who keep it standing. Daniel had learned. He had also delayed. Claire had wanted him to tell the board when the time was right, renegotiate the lease, protect the land, and use some of the trust income to repair their house. Daniel kept waiting for a cleaner moment. Then she got sick. Money disappeared into treatments, travel, and unpaid leave. After she died, the house was lost. The trust's liquid funds were tied up in a legal dispute with a distant cousin, and Daniel moved with Lily into a rental at the edge of town. He still owned the ground beneath one of the county's wealthiest institutions. He just did not have enough cash that morning to fill his gas tank. At school, Lily reached for the door, then paused. Dad? Yeah? Did Mom ever meet mean people? Daniel looked through the windshield at children crossing beneath the school awning. All the time. What did she do? She was polite until politeness became permission. Lily considered that. What does that mean? I'm still figuring it out. She kissed his cheek and ran inside. When Daniel returned to Renford, 3 orange survey flags had appeared along the eastern grove. He stopped the truck. The flags traced a line through 12 protected oaks and continued toward the creek buffer where no construction was allowed without the landowner's consent. Daniel crouched beside the nearest marker. The plastic tag carried the name of a development firm. He pulled out his phone and photographed every flag. Then he noticed something else. One marker had been driven directly through the small bronze boundary disc set by his grandfather in 1961. Daniel brushed the mud away with his thumb. Renford lease limit, the disc read. Behind him, a mower started, then another. Morning spread across the club as though nothing had changed. Daniel stood slowly. Someone was planning to build on land they did not have the right to touch. At 9 o'clock, Meredith held a staff briefing in the service corridor behind the ballroom. Department heads stood with clipboards while kitchen workers moved around them, carrying crates of produce. The board has approved preliminary planning for the East Campus improvement, she said. A wellness pavilion, expanded parking, and 12 private cottages. We are not discussing details with members until the financing package is complete. Daniel stood near the back. The East Grove is outside the development boundary, he said. The corridor quieted. Meredith did not look at him immediately. She finished a note on her tablet. Your department will be responsible for site preparation once permits are issued. Permits won't change the ground lease. Now she looked up. Most staff members did not know there was a ground lease. A club that old seemed permanent. The idea that it rented the earth beneath its buildings sounded impossible. Meredith's voice remained mild. Legal matters are being handled by legal professionals. The survey line crosses the creek buffer and 12 protected oaks. Our environmental consultant found no protected impact. He surveyed from the current property map. Yes. The current map is wrong. A banquet manager stared at the floor. Meredith took 2 steps toward Daniel. Messer Mercer, I value employees who take pride in their work. I do not value employees who confuse familiarity with authority. Daniel felt the old heat again. He wanted to tell her exactly whose authority she was confusing. Instead, he said, ask your attorney for Exhibit C of the 1959 lease. Her eyes narrowed. Return to your duties. He did. That was one of Daniel's weaknesses. He had spent years believing restraint and avoidance were the same virtue. He could endure insult. He could absorb inconvenience. He could wait for the perfect evidence, the perfect timing, the perfect calm. But waiting had a cost paid by other people. At lunch, he found the assistant superintendent, Luis Ortega, in the equipment shed. You know about the expansion? Daniel asked. Luis nodded without looking up from a mower blade. They're calling it a rescue plan. For the club? Membership is down 12%. The bank wants new revenue. Meredith promised the board she could turn the east side into something younger families would pay for. Daniel handed him a photograph of the boundary disc. Luis studied it. Is this what I think it is? What do you think it is? A reason to stay out of this. Daniel almost smiled. Luis had worked at Renford for 18 years and had 3 children in college. He knew the difference between courage and unemployment. Did anyone ask grounds for drainage reports? Daniel said. No. The cottage road would cut across the old overflow channel. Luis lowered his voice. The consultant says the new culverts can carry it. The consultant has rainfall data from after the west retention pond was built. The East Grove drains differently. You told Meredith? She told me professionals were handling it. Luis looked at him. Aren't you a professional? Not to her. That afternoon, Daniel requested a copy of the development presentation from the operations office. The administrator refused. Director authorization only. He requested the environmental report. Director authorization. He requested the updated site plan. The administrator sighed. Daniel, please don't make this harder than it is. What is it? A job. He returned to the grounds. For the next week, surveyors came and went. Daniel watched without interfering. He photographed flag positions, measured distances from the original discs, and compared them to copies of the lease exhibits kept in the cedar box. The error was not subtle. The development map treated the eastern boundary as though it followed Mill Creek. The original lease line sat between 40 and 90 feet west of the creek, leaving a protected strip owned by the trust and excluded from club use. The proposed cottages, access road, and pavilion all crossed into that strip. More troubling was the drainage plan. To create parking, the developer intended to fill a shallow depression Daniel's grandfather called the breathing field. It looked like ordinary lawn most of the year. During severe storms, it held runoff long enough to keep water from rushing toward the lower neighborhoods. Daniel had seen it fill twice. The consultant had marked it underutilized open space. On Thursday, Lily came to the club after school because Daniel could not afford the extra 3 days of childcare before payday. She sat on an overturned bucket in the maintenance barn doing math homework while he sharpened edging blades. Meredith entered without knocking. Her gaze went from Lily to Daniel. "We discussed this." Her sitter canceled. "You were told children are not allowed here." She's in the break area. She is sitting beside industrial equipment. The equipment is disconnected. Meredith's attention landed on Lily's notebook. A colored pencil drawing filled the top half of the page. Daniel in green work clothes, Lily beside him, and a woman with yellow hair above them in the clouds. Claire. At the bottom, Lily had written, "My family has 2 people and 1 angel." Meredith's face softened for less than a second. Then the door behind her opened, and 2 board members entered with the development consultant. Whatever human response had begun inside her disappeared beneath professional posture. "This cannot continue," she said. Daniel set down the blade. "It won't. You said that last time." I said I understood. I didn't say my daughter would stop needing me. One board member, Harrison Pike, shifted impatiently. He was the club treasurer and owner of a regional construction company positioned to receive part of the expansion work. Meredith spoke carefully. "Your personal circumstances do not exempt you from workplace policy." "No. They just explain why she's here." Pike gave a short laugh. "This is a private club, not a daycare." Lily closed her notebook. Daniel turned toward him. "She can hear you." Pike glanced at the child as though noticing furniture. "Then she can learn that adults have responsibilities." Daniel took one step forward. Meredith moved between them. "Enough." His jaw tightened. For one sharp moment, he wanted to tell Pike about the land, cancel the lease, and watch certainty drain out of him. Instead, he looked at Lily's face. "Pack your things," he said. In the truck, Lily buckled her seatbelt without speaking. Daniel started the engine, then shut it off. "I'm sorry. For what?" "For getting angry. You didn't yell." "I wanted to." "Mr. Pike is mean." He was careless. "That's a fancy word for mean." Daniel looked at the clubhouse through the windshield. "Sometimes people say cruel things because they think the person hearing them cannot change anything. Can you?" The question landed harder than accusation. Daniel could change a great deal. He could reveal the trust. He could stop the expansion with one formal letter. He could demand market rent at the next renewal and alter Renford's future. But the trust litigation was unresolved. His cousin had challenged Daniel's authority, arguing that the land should be sold. A premature confrontation could complicate the case. Daniel's attorney had advised patience until the court confirmed sole trusteeship. He had used that advice as shelter. "I'm working on it," he said. Lily looked out the window. "That sounds like waiting." Claire's words in a child's voice. That night, after Lily slept, Daniel spread the lease, survey copies, and drainage records across the kitchen table. Rain pressed softly against the window. The rented house smelled of damp plaster. He called Naomi Chen, the attorney handling the trust dispute. "I need to issue a notice to Renford," he said. Naomi was silent for a moment. "About the expansion? You knew?" "I monitor county filings. They submitted a preliminary zoning request yesterday. They're using the wrong boundary." "I saw. And you didn't call?" "I was going to in the morning. The hearing on your cousin's claim is in 9 days. If we win, your authority is clean. If we act before then, he may argue you damaged trust income. They're planning to damage trust land." "Planning is not breaking ground. Survey stakes are already in," Naomi exhaled. "Photograph everything. Do not confront them as trustee yet. They may start clearing. Then we seek an emergency injunction." Daniel looked at Lily's drawing, which she had left on the counter. "I've spent 2 years waiting for clean timing. This is 9 days. I know." He ended the call and sat in the kitchen until midnight. The following morning, Meredith summoned him to her office. Her office overlooked the first tee. On one wall hung architectural renderings of the proposed pavilion. Glass, stone, fire pits, people in white robes holding green drinks. She indicated a chair. Daniel remained standing. "I have received reports that you are photographing survey work and questioning contractors," she said. "I photographed boundary markers. You are not authorized to document a confidential project. They're in the open. That is not the point. What is? The point is whether you intend to perform your job or campaign against management." Daniel looked at the rendering. "The cottages sit in a flood path. They sit beside a creek. No, The creek is where water goes most days. The field is where it goes on the worst day. Meredith folded her hands. The plan was prepared by engineers. Engineers who never watched that ground during a hurricane. Her mouth tightened. Daniel stepped closer to the rendering and pointed at the access road. This grade sends runoff toward Ashbrook Lane. That neighborhood is below the club. Yes, it has municipal drainage. Not for what you're sending, Meredith studied him differently now. Not as an equal, but no longer as background. Where did you learn to read site plans? My grandfather surveyed land. I worked with him. It was true, though incomplete. Daniel had also spent 4 years in civil engineering school before leaving to care for his mother, and later completed certifications in stormwater management. He had never become licensed. Life had interrupted the clean version of his future. Meredith tapped the rendering. Our lender requires a groundbreaking date this quarter. The board has approved the project. If you have a formal objection, submit it through your supervisor. I did. And? My supervisor was told not to discuss it. For a moment, something weary appeared in Meredith's face. You think I don't understand risk, she said. This club is 6 months from violating its loan covenants. If membership keeps falling, 140 people may lose their jobs. The expansion is not vanity. It is survival. Daniel had expected arrogance. The truth was more complicated. Survival doesn't make the boundary move. No, she said. But refusing to move guarantees failure. He looked at the renderings again. You're building the rescue in the wrong place. Then bring me an alternative that meets the revenue target, the lender deadline, and the board's expectations. I'm a groundskeeper. That has not stopped you from offering engineering opinions. The words were sharp, but the challenge was real. Daniel nodded once. When do you need it? Meredith blinked. Monday. It was Friday afternoon. Then I'll bring it Monday. As he reached the door, she said, Mr. Mercer, he turned. If this becomes another lecture about trees, do not waste my time. Daniel looked back at the glass pavilion drawn over the breathing field. It isn't the trees you should be afraid of. For the first time, Meredith did not dismiss him. She looked at the plan after he left. Daniel spent the weekend at the public library with Lily coloring beside him. He pulled county elevation data, rainfall tables, traffic counts, and old agricultural drainage maps. At home, he traced an alternative on translucent paper. Instead of developing the Eastern Grove, the club could renovate the unused North Stables into guest suites, convert an aging practice field into a smaller wellness center, and reopen a service road already connected to utilities. The plan preserved the creek buffer, cost less in stormwater mitigation, and could be phased without closing the course. It was not perfect. It also exposed another problem. The financial assumptions in Renford's proposal depended on selling 12 cottage memberships before construction. Yet the ground lease prohibited subleases longer than 1 year without trustee consent. Whoever prepared the projections had treated clubland as owned property. On Sunday night, Daniel called Naomi again. Can they sell cottage memberships that function like leases? Not without consent from the trust. They've included the revenue in their bank package. Do you have the package? No. Just the public zoning narrative and the renderings. Then don't accuse anyone. I'm not accusing. I'm noticing. That habit of yours is going to make my life difficult. It already made mine difficult. Naomi laughed softly. The court moved the hearing. Thursday morning. Better or worse? Better. Your cousin's attorney withdrew 2 claims. Daniel looked at the alternative plan on his table. After Thursday, can I act? If the order is clean? Yes. Monday morning, he entered Meredith's office carrying a single rolled plan and a 3-page cost summary. She had 2 consultants with her. You had the weekend, she said. Let's see what 3 days of groundskeeping produces. One consultant smiled politely. Daniel unrolled the plan. For 20 minutes, he explained the North Stable alternative. He showed utility access, grading advantages, phased construction, and lower permit risk. He did not mention the trust. The consultants stopped smiling. One asked, Where did you get the pre-1984 drainage contour? County Archive. That map isn't digitized. I know. The second consultant leaned over the page. Your runoff calculation assumes a 100-year storm. The club's current plan fails at the 25. That is not established. Daniel pointed to 3 lines. Your model uses the West Pond's storage volume for the East Basin. Different watershed. The consultant went still. Meredith noticed. What does that mean? She asked. He cleared his throat. It means the model may overstate available storage. By how much? I'd need to rerun it. Daniel slid a handwritten table across the desk. I did. The consultant read it. Color rose above his collar. Meredith looked at Daniel. You had access to their software? No. The equations were in the appendix. You calculated this by hand? Spreadsheet. The office became quiet enough to hear sprinklers ticking outside. This was the first moment Meredith understood that Daniel's certainty did not come from stubbornness. It came from work. She studied the alternative. The stable plan produces 8 suites, not 12 cottages. 8 in Phase 1, 6 more above the West Annex in Phase 2. The members will hate construction near the clubhouse. They'll hate flooded houses more. One consultant began to object. Meredith raised a hand. How much does this save? Rough estimate? $2.1 million in site work and mitigation. Her eyes sharpened. You are certain? No. I'm careful. That answer unsettled her more than certainty would have. She kept the plan. For 2 days, Daniel heard nothing. Then Harrison Pike found him near the East Grove. You've been busy, Pike said. Daniel shut off the leaf blower. Pike wore a navy vest with the club crest and held a cigar he was not permitted to smoke on course. Meredith showed the board your little proposal. It's not little. No, just inconvenient. For your construction company? Pike smiled. Be cautious, Mr. Mercer. About drainage? About imagining that access to wealthy people makes you one of them. Daniel looked at the orange flags behind Pike. No danger of that. Pike stepped closer. The East Project is going forward. People with actual liability have made that decision. Daniel's phone vibrated in his pocket. Naomi. He let it ring. Pike tapped ash into the grass. Remove those boundary markers before tomorrow's member tour. They're ugly. They're survey markers. They're temporary. So are most bad decisions. The smile vanished from Pike's face. Do what you're told. After he left, Daniel called Naomi. We won, she said. The court confirmed you as sole acting trustee. Clean order. No conditions. Daniel closed his eyes. For years, the authority had existed but felt suspended, tangled in grief, debt, and family conflict. Now the path was clear. Naomi continued. I can send formal notice this afternoon. What do you want? Daniel looked across the grove. First, a demand for the full financing package, development contracts, and site plans under the lease audit clause. Second, a stop work notice on surveying and clearing east of the original boundary. And third, he thought of Meredith's office, the pressure in her voice, the 140 jobs. Offer a meeting before we seek an injunction. Naomi paused. You still haven't told them who you are. No. Why? Daniel watched wind move through the oaks. I wanted to know what they would do when they thought I couldn't matter. And now you know? Not all of it. The formal notice reached Renford at 4:12 that afternoon. At 4:20, Meredith called an emergency meeting with the board, legal counsel, and Harrison Pike. At 4:40, she called Daniel's supervisor and requested Daniel's personnel file. She found his application. Daniel Mercer, grounds, maintenance technician, prior work in municipal landscaping, stormwater certification, incomplete civil engineering degree. Nothing about the trust. At 5:10, she called the club's attorney. Who is the Mercer Family Trust's acting trustee? We've dealt through counsel for decades. Find out. At 5:30, Daniel was asked to report to Meredith's office. He arrived with soil on his boots. Meredith stood behind her desk. Pike sat near the window. The club attorney, Samuel Voss, had a printed copy of Naomi's notice. Did you know about this? Meredith asked. Daniel read the first page. Yes. Pike leaned forward. How? The boundary discs. That is not an answer. It is the beginning of one. Meredith placed both palms on the desk. The trust claims our expansion crosses excluded land. It does. It also invokes an audit clause. It has that right. Her eyes narrowed. You speak as though you represent it. Daniel looked at Voss. The attorney's expression had changed. He had noticed the surname. Before Daniel could answer, Pike stood. This is absurd. He is a grounds employee who has interfered with a board-approved project, accessed confidential information, and coordinated with an outside party. I used public records, Daniel said. You undermined management. I warned management. You were told to stop. Meredith remained silent. She was looking at Daniel as though trying to bring two versions of him into focus. Are you connected to the trust? She asked. Daniel could have ended it there. Instead, he said, your attorney should respond to the notice. Pike laughed once. There. That arrogance. You hand him a mower and he thinks he controls the property. Daniel's voice stayed even. A mower teaches you more about property than a conference table. Pike moved around the desk. Meredith raised a hand. Enough, she looked at Daniel. I am suspending you pending an investigation into misconduct and unauthorized disclosure. What did I disclose? The project. To the landowner. The project is on club property. Some of it isn't, her composure cracked. You do not decide that. Daniel held her gaze. No, he said. The lease does, for a second. Voss looked ready to speak. Pike cut him off. Escort him out, Meredith hesitated. That hesitation mattered. It meant some part of her understood they were moving too fast. Then she looked at the renderings, the bank deadline, and Harrison Pike, whose company had already advanced pre-construction costs. Fear chose for her. Turn in your keys, she said. Daniel removed the maintenance keys from his belt and placed them on her desk. Among them was an old brass key, darker than the others. Meredith touched it. This one isn't club issue. No, what does it open? The original gatehouse. We don't have an original gatehouse. You built the wine cellar over it. Pike rolled his eyes. Get him out. Daniel took the brass key back. I'll return what belongs to the club, he said. He placed the remaining keys on the desk and walked out. Louis waited near the maintenance barn. They fired you? Suspended. That's firing with paperwork. Daniel opened his locker. A clean shirt, work gloves, framed photograph of Claire and Lily, spare boots. Louis helped without speaking. When Daniel lifted the photograph, a folded drawing fell from behind it. Lily had made it months earlier, 3 figures beneath an oak tree. This time Claire was not in the clouds. She stood beside them, transparent yellow pencil around her body. Louis saw it. She'd be mad at you, he said. Claire? For waiting this long. Daniel smiled faintly. She spent most of our marriage mad at me for waiting. Outside, Meredith and Pike crossed the service road with 2 board members. Pike was talking loudly about loyalty and discipline. Lily's school bus had dropped her at the employee entrance as arranged before Daniel's suspension. She stood beside the maintenance gate with her backpack. Meredith saw her. The timing should have softened the scene. Instead, pressure made her colder. Messer, your daughter cannot remain on club grounds. Daniel carried the locker box in both hands. We're leaving. Now. Lily looked at the box, then at her father. Dad? It's okay. Pike nodded toward Daniel's metal toolbox near the flower bed. That too. Daniel set down the box and reached for the toolbox. Meredith had been receiving calls for an hour. The bank, the board chair, the club attorney. Her career, the expansion, and the institution she had promised to save seemed suddenly threatened by a trust she could not see, and a groundskeeper who would not explain himself. She stepped toward the toolbox. Leave it, she said. Club property. It was my grandfather's. It was stored in our facility. That doesn't make it yours. The sentence struck the exact nerve she had been defending all day. Meredith seized the handle. Daniel reached for it. The rusted latch broke. The toolbox swung open and crashed into the muddy flower bed. Wrenches, pruning shears, gloves, and a small wooden-handled trowel spilled into wet soil. Lily gasped. Meredith froze, still holding the handle. Everyone nearby stopped. Daniel crouched and began gathering the tools. Mud spread across his knees. Lily knelt beside him, crying without sound. Meredith's face showed regret, but pride moved faster. Take your belongings and get off club property, she said. Daniel picked up the old trowel. His grandfather's initials were burned into the handle. He stood. The anger inside him was no longer hot. It was clean. He looked at Meredith. Send every notice from now on to Naomi Chen. Your attorney? The landowner's attorney. Pike gave a dismissive laugh. Daniel lifted the broken toolbox. Tomorrow, he said, you'll understand the difference. He walked toward the gate with Lily holding his sleeve. Behind them, Meredith stared at the mud on her cream cuff. For the first time, she wondered whether she had just made a mistake large enough to bury the club. The next morning, Samuel Voss called Meredith before 7. "I identified the trustee," he said. She stood alone in her kitchen, coffee untouched. "Who?" "Daniel Thomas Mercer, the groundskeeper." Meredith sat down. Voss continued. "The Mercer Family Trust owns all 212 acres beneath Renford. Daniel is the sole acting trustee. He can stop the expansion, audit the financing, refuse the cottage plan, and influence every future lease term." She remembered him saying the lease would decide. She had heard insolence because it was easier than hearing knowledge. That afternoon, Meredith walked alone to the East Grove. Beneath the mud, she found the bronze disc Daniel had shown them. Renford lease limit. It had been there the entire time. She ordered the consultant to rerun the drainage model with the correct basin data. At 6, he called back. Daniel was right. The proposed fill could increase storm discharge toward Ashbrook Lane by nearly 40%. Saving Renford had become Meredith's excuse for every compromise. She had told herself survival justified speed, hardness, and selective hearing. Now the person she had treated as an obstacle had protected the club from a disastrous mistake. Before noon, at Pike's insistence, the executive committee converted Daniel's suspension into a formal termination. 2 days later, members filled the oak-paneled ballroom for an emergency meeting. Daniel entered with Lily in the cedar box. Harrison Pike whispered to security. "Emmer Mercer," Meredith said, forcing the authority expected of her, "you were instructed to stay off club property. I came because your attorney sent notice of a vote affecting the land. The land is not your concern." Lily tightened her grip on his hand. Meredith stepped down. "You worked here. That did not make this place yours." "No," Daniel said. "Working here didn't." He placed the cedar box on a table and opened it. Inside lay the original 1959 ground lease, Thomas Mercer's survey compass, the old gatehouse key, and a sealed trustee certificate. The room went so quiet, the rain sounded loud against the glass. Naomi Chen entered through the side doors carrying one black folder. "My name is Naomi Chen. I represent the Mercer Family Land Trust and its sole acting trustee, Daniel Mercer." Harrison Pike stared at Voss. "That's impossible." "It is confirmed," Voss said. Daniel lifted the lease. "My grandfather signed this agreement in 1959. Renford received the right to operate on Mercer land under specific conditions. The club owns its buildings. It does not own the ground beneath them." A murmur crossed the room. "The expansion crosses the lease boundary by up to 90 feet, fills the east overflow basin, and assumes the club can sell long-term cottage rights without the trust's consent." Pike stood. His pen rolled from the table and struck the floor. "This is blackmail." Daniel looked at him. "No, it is a boundary." He placed a 3-page report before the board. Appendix 4 of the consultant's model assigns West Basin storage to the east watershed. Table 7 uses the wrong outflow coefficient. Correcting those inputs increases discharge toward Ashbrook Lane by 38.6% in a 100-year storm. A board member turned toward the consultant. "Is that accurate?" The consultant swallowed. "We reran the model." "Yes." The ventilation system hummed above them. Daniel unrolled his alternative plan. The north stables can be converted in phases. It meets the lender's first revenue target, costs approximately $2 million less in site work, and preserves the grove. Pike laughed too loudly. Prepared by a groundskeeper. Meredith spoke before fear could stop her. Prepared by the person who found the engineering error. Everyone looked at her. Pike's face hardened. "You are taking his side?" "I am taking the side of facts we should have checked before humiliating the person who brought them to us." Naomi opened her folder. The trust audit also found a pre-construction agreement between Renford and Pike Regional Development, including a success fee tied to approval of the East Plan. Heads turned toward Pike. "That was disclosed," he said. "Not to the full board," Voss answered. Pike looked at Meredith. "You knew we needed speed. I did not know you had a signed fee agreement." Daniel did not smile. He looked tired. The board chair removed her glasses. "Master Mercer, what does the trust intend to do?" Every person in the room seemed to wait for punishment. Daniel looked at Lily. She had drawn him beneath a great oak, its roots spreading under the clubhouse. The trust will stop the East project, require independent engineering, and investigate Mr. Pike's agreement. But I will not cancel the club's lease. A breath moved through the room. The employees should not lose their jobs because leadership was careless. The trust will consider the North Stable plan under 4 conditions: independent review, restoration of the Grove, worker representation in development meetings, and a family emergency policy for hourly staff. Meredith closed her eyes briefly. Then she faced him. I owe you an apology. I treated your knowledge as insubordination because of your uniform. I treated your daughter as an inconvenience because I was afraid of losing control. When you warned me, I made your warning about my authority instead of the land. Daniel's expression remained guarded. I cannot undo it, she said. But I am sorry. Apologies matter when they change the next decision. Then let that be the standard. The board suspended Harrison Pike. He later resigned, and his company's agreement was canceled. Meredith offered her resignation. The board required her to complete a supervised restructuring before deciding her future. It was not revenge. It was consequence. Daniel was offered the position of Director of Land and Facilities with a salary that could change his and Lily's life. Pride told him to refuse. Then he remembered Claire had never admired suffering for its own sake. I'll accept on 2 conditions, he said. I leave by 4 on school days, and Luis Ortega becomes grounds superintendent, the board agreed. 3 months later, work began at the North Stables. No oaks were cut. Monitoring wells protected the overflow basin, and the club created emergency childcare support for hourly employees. Meredith remained in a reduced role. One evening, she found Daniel and Lily at the old gatehouse beneath the wine cellar. She carried the wooden-handled trowel from his broken toolbox, cleaned and repaired. I owe you an apology too, she told Lily. You made my dad kneel in the mud. I did. You were mean. Yes, Lily studied her, then handed her the flashlight. You can hold this. Together they opened the old room. On the stone wall were the carved names of workers who had built the first course. Masons, gardeners, carpenters, ditch diggers. Thomas Mercer's name was among them. What will you do with this place? Meredith asked. A history room, Daniel said. Not about owners, about workers. That seems right. It seems late. Meredith accepted the words without defense. It does. In autumn, Daniel and Lily moved into a modest house at the edge of the Mercer land. It had a dry roof, 3 bedrooms, and a porch facing the eastern oaks. On their first night, they ate grilled cheese at a folding table. Lily placed Claire's photograph on the windowsill. Are you still a groundskeeper? She asked. Yes, but you're a director and an owner. Yes, that's too many jobs, Daniel smiled. The groundskeeper is the important one. Why? Because owning land tells you what belongs to you. Caring for it tells you what you belong to. Later, Lily fell asleep against his shoulder on the porch. Through the trees, the club lights glowed beneath the dark line of the grove. A person's worth is often hidden by the uniform. Others choose to see first. Mud on a sleeve can conceal knowledge, and a quiet voice can carry more authority than a room full of titles. Power becomes dangerous when it mistakes obedience for proof and appearance for truth. Yet dignity is not found in reversing cruelty and delivering it back. Daniel did not win simply because the land belonged to him. He won because, when he could have destroyed those who mocked him, he chose to protect the workers, the neighborhood, his daughter, and the earth entrusted to his care. Ownership gave him leverage. Character decided how he used it. Long after the meeting was forgotten, the eastern grove remained. Its roots held the soil through every storm.